What's going on, guys? My name is Matt, and when it comes to graphics cards, finding low budget options can be pretty difficult, and once you start getting around the $50 price point, the options become very unappealing. With that being said, I know a lot of you who watch the channel are on very tight budgets, so I've always tried to find good budget gems so that you can get into PC gaming for as cheap as possible. Because of this, I decided to pick up and test out a graphics card that at the time of writing this consistently goes for $25 on eBay, and it actually looks kind of promising for how cheap it is. This is the AMD FirePro V5800. The V5800 is a workstation class GPU released 11 years ago in April of 2010 for a price of a little under $500, meaning I picked this up for 1/20th of what it originally retailed for. It's a single slot card and the PCB is only 9 inches, but it has this odd metal backplate slash bracket that adds an additional 4.5 inches, making the total length 13.5 inches or right around 33 centimeters. This card is running on the Terascale 2 architecture, which uses the gigantic 40nm process. With the 74 watt TDP, the V5800 doesn't require any external PCIe power connectors because it draws all of its power from the PCIe slot itself. One nice thing is that while it does only have 1GB of video memory, that 1GB is actually GDDR5, which is great to see. The GPU core clock on this guy is 690 MHz, and I will be attempting to overclock it later in the video. The cooler design is kind of interesting, being a single fan blower style card, but it actually just exhausts the air into the case as the PCIe bracket is fully closed. In terms of ports, this card has a weird selection with 2 display ports and 1 DVI port. I'm not sure how common this layout was back in 2010, but it's odd seeing a card with DisplayPort and without HDMI. In terms of a test system, I honestly had a bit of a hard time deciding what to select. Pairing this with anything modern didn't make much sense, but pairing it with something old and low end may not allow us to see the full capabilities of this card. Because of this, I decided to test with a mid to high end CPU from the era this card came from. What I went with is the Intel Core i7-2600, a CPU from 2011. I think this provides a good middle ground and should allow this GPU to stretch its legs. The i7-2600 is a 4-core, 8-thread CPU running on the legendary Sandy Bridge architecture. I have it inside of this Asus 1155 ITX motherboard, which is pretty basic but works out fine for this situation. To cool the 2600, I'm using a copper core stock cooler, and the system is using 16GB of RAM. So with the test system build, I was ready to install the graphics card and test it out. It installs into a 16x PCIe slot just like any other graphics card, and again, no external PCIe power connectors were required. I went ahead and booted into Windows for the first time and was happy to see it booted up just fine. With that being said, it was clear no drivers were installed, so I headed to the AMD drivers page and searched around for the right drivers. I found them by clicking Professional Graphics, Legacy Products, FirePro V Series, and then finally V5800. The latest drivers available are version 15.201. These are from February of 2017, which made me worried about game compatibility and optimization. With that being said, these installed fine, everything was up and running, and I was ready to jump into some games. I first wanted to run the test with this card in its current stock condition, then see if I can do anything to improve performance. Honestly, going into testing, I wasn't entirely sure what to expect, but because this card did only cost $25, I didn't have very high hopes. So let's start off with the games this card did well in and then work our way down. Let's start things off with CSGO. CSGO is a very easy to run FPS game, and I tested at 720p low settings. I opted into a round of Team Deathmatch on Dust 2 and actually saw decent performance. The FPS stayed in the 100 to 110 range most of the time, which was pretty smooth and should be fine for casual play. Next up, let's talk about a game that surprised me a lot, which is GTA 5. I was shocked when I found out GTA 5 was playable on this card. With the built-in benchmark at 720p low, this card put out an 82 FPS average, and at 900p low, it put out a 66 FPS average. I decided to also test in-game on the first driving mission with Franklin. I found 900p low was the best middle ground between looks and performance. During the mission, the FPS stayed in the 50 to 60 FPS range, and overall it was a smooth and enjoyable experience. Again, I was kind of mind blown this card was able to handle GTA 5 at such smooth frame rates. Next up is another popular FPS game, which is Valorant. This game isn't very hard to run but is very popular, so I figured this might end up being a good option for budget Valorant players. I tested this game at 1080p low and hopped into a match. While playing, I saw the FPS stay in the low 100s most of the time. This was pretty smooth and enjoyable. Again, I don't know if I'd try to play competitively with this card, but for casual play it works great. Next up is Overwatch, and this was my first time firing up Overwatch in a few years. I tested this game at 900p and saw the FPS stay in the 50 to 60 FPS range, which was perfectly playable to me. I forgot how much fun Overwatch was and actually ended up re-downloading it on my personal rig after testing it out on here. So again, Overwatch on this PC proved to be a smooth and enjoyable experience. Next, I tested Minecraft because I know a lot of you have requested that I test budget builds with it. I set the resolution to 720p and left everything else to default. I opted into a creative world and flew around to see what performance was like. I saw the FPS stay in the 50 to 60 FPS range in most instances. I also tested with a bunch of TNT and was impressed to see the FPS never drop below 30. Overall, Minecraft definitely works fine on this card. Next, let's talk about Fortnite. This was a game that I was actually disappointed in the results. I tested at 900p low in a Team Rumbles match, which to be fair is a bit of a worst case scenario. Doing this resulted in a stuttery 39 FPS average. This was actually on the verge of unplayable, but for a lot of people this performance is probably okay. What's confusing to me is the fact I've seen other people use this card to play Fortnite with similar test hardware and get better results than this, so it may be something I'm doing wrong. Next up is Rainbow Six Siege, which again was another disappointment. At 720p low, I tested both with the built-in benchmark and by hopping into a training grounds match. With the built-in benchmark, I saw an average of 45 FPS, which is decent, and in-game I saw the FPS stay in the upper 30s to lower 40s range, which was honestly again on the verge of being unplayable and probably isn't even good enough for very casual play. Finally, the last game I wanted to test was Apex Legends. Unfortunately, I couldn't get it to run and it crashed every time I attempted to get into a game. Overall, I was really impressed with this card's performance, especially taking into account I only paid $25 for it. Now, after the initial tests, I wanted to try a few things in an attempt to squeeze a little more performance out of the card. The first thing I wanted to do was try and overclock it, but unfortunately all the overclocking options on MSI Afterburner were grayed out, which leads me to believe overclocking this card may not be possible. With that being said, I still had one more thing to try that might not help performance necessarily, but could help in other ways, and that's repasting the card. See, over time, thermal paste on the GPU die dries up, which makes it hard for the cooler to do its job and can result in higher temps, and worst case scenario, a loss in performance from thermal throttling. Before opening up the card, I saw the temps peak around 67 degrees, which was perfectly acceptable, so this wasn't 100% necessary, but I was curious to see the effect it would have. To get to the GPU die, I had to remove these 9 screws for the backplate, then lift it away. Then I had to remove these 4 screws and the bracket here. With those out, I pulled the cooler away from the card like this and was presented with a bit of a dusty mess. I didn't spend a whole bunch of time on this, so I just wiped off some of the dust and removed the old crusty thermal paste. Then I could apply a new drop of thermal paste, which I actually like to spread out when applying to GPU dies just because they don't have an IHS to distribute the heat like you'd see in a CPU. Then all I had to do was reassemble the card and pop it back into the test bench. Unfortunately, the temps seemed to stay exactly the same, which was a disappointment to see. I'm worrying I may not have added enough thermal compound, but that may just be me overthinking it. In the end, I had to stick with its stock performance as overclocking and repasting did nothing. With that being said, its stock performance is pretty darn good, taking into account the $25 I paid for it. Obviously, I think this card is great, but I'm interested to hear what you guys think of it in the comments below. I also want to hear if there's other budget GPUs you guys want me to buy and test out. I'll make sure to leave links to the parts mentioned in this video in the description. So yeah guys, I think this wraps this video up. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And as always, this is Matt from Tech by Matt, signing out.